A grieving cowboy saves a frozen stranger in Wyoming's wilds, risking his fragile peace. But what secrets does her deadly vendetta hide? In the desolate Wyoming wilderness, where the cold wind howled like a banshee through gnarled pines and snow-dusted plains, Harper Kane rode alone, a solitary figure etched against the endless gray sky, his heart a vault of unspoken sorrows, sealed tight by memories of a war that stained his hands with blood, men he'd hanged under orders that still haunted his dreams, and a woman whose name he could no longer whisper without tasting ash. His horse, a weary bay named Jericho, trudged through the deepening snow, each step a testament to their shared exhaustion, as Harper's eyes, weathered and sharp, scanned the horizon for something, anything to anchor him to this life he barely lived. The world was silent save for the wind's relentless scream, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten lives, of stories buried beneath the frost. Then on that icy afternoon, as snow bit into the earth like a predator's teeth, Harper's gaze caught on a shape half buried in a drift, a young woman, her skin pale as moonlight, tinged blue with cold, her dress torn and soaked, clinging to her frail form like a shroud. She was no older than 20, her dark hair matted with ice, her lips cracked and trembling, yet her eyes, those hollow haunted eyes, burned with a fire that both repelled and beckoned. When he dismounted and approached, she didn't scream or beg, didn't flinch as most would in the face of death's cold embrace. Instead she whispered, her voice barely a thread, "Don't touch me." The words struck Harper like a blade, sharp and precise, stirring something deep within him, a memory of his own voice, years ago, pleading for distance from a world that had broken him. Against every instinct honed by years of solitude, he knelt beside her, his rough hands trembling as he wrapped her in the wool blanket from his saddlebag, its faded red threads, a stark contrast to the white expanse around them. She didn't resist, but she didn't thank him either. Her silence was a wall, unyielding and cold, as he carried her to a crumbling hunter's cabin he'd spotted earlier, its sagging roof barely holding back the storm. Inside he built a fire, the crackle of kindling a fragile defiance against the wind's wail, and set her near the flames, her body shivering, but her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if she saw ghosts in the flickering shadows. She didn't speak, not even as warmth returned color to her cheeks, and Harper, a man who'd learned to live with silence, felt the weight of her quiet like a stone on his chest. Those eyes, empty yet brimming with a story too heavy to tell, held a darkness that dwarfed the Wyoming winter, a tale of fear, so profound, it made the cold seem a kinder fate. Why would someone fear people more than death itself? Harper wondered, his mind tugging at the edges of her mystery. Had she fled a home where hands meant harm, where trust was a currency long spent? Or was it something deeper, a wound carved by betrayal, by someone who'd promised love but delivered pain? He thought of his own past, of the woman he'd loved, Clara, whose laughter once warmed him like summer, only to vanish when the war's shadow swallowed his soul. He'd never spoken of her, not in 10 years, but this stranger's gaze stirred that old ache, as if her silence mirrored his own. As night fell, the cabin creaked under the storm's assault, and Harper sat across from her, his Colt revolver resting on his knee, not for her but for the world outside, a world he no longer trusted. She ate the jerky he offered, her movements mechanical, her eyes never meeting his, and he wondered if she saw him as another threat, another shadow to fear. Yet he couldn't leave her, not when her fragility mirrored his own, not when her silence spoke to the part of him that had long ago stopped speaking. The firelight danced across her face, revealing scars, faint lines on her wrists, a jagged mark across her cheek, each one a chapter in a story she guarded fiercely. Harper's mind raced with questions. Was she running from a husband, a father, a preacher with a twisted sense of salvation? Or was it something worse, something that made the wilderness, with all its cruelty, a safer haven than any human touch? He thought of the war, of men who'd turned on their own, of brothers who'd sold their souls for survival, and wondered if her fear was born of such betrayal. The night deepened, and the wind's howl became a chorus of ghosts, whispering of losses neither could name. Harper spoke softly, his voice rough from disuse, telling her of the stars beyond the storm, of constellations he'd learned as a boy, hoping to draw her out, but she only stared into the fire, her fingers clutching the blanket as if it were her only shield. He didn't push, didn't ask her name or her story, knowing some wounds bleed worse when prodded, yet curiosity burned in him, a flame as fierce as the one before them. What could break a soul so thoroughly that it feared kindness more than death? He thought of the men he'd hanged, their eyes pleading or defiant, and wondered if she'd seen such eyes, if she'd been the one to wield the rope or the one to escape it. The cabin grew warmer, but her silence remained cold, a barrier he couldn't breach. As dawn crept through the cracks in the walls, painting the room in pale light, she finally spoke, her voice a whisper. "They'll find me." 3 words, heavy with dread, and Harper's heart clenched, knowing she didn't mean the storm or the cold. Who were they? Bounty hunters? Family? Demons cloaked in human skin? He wanted to promise safety, to swear he'd protect her, but the weight of his own failures, Clara's face, the men he couldn't save choked the words in his throat. Instead he offered her his canteen, his last biscuit, small gestures that felt futile against the vastness of her fear. She took them, her fingers brushing his, and for a moment, her eyes met his still empty, still lost, but with a flicker of something new, something that might have been trust or merely desperation. Harper didn't know, but he felt it like a spark, a reason to keep going, to carry her story alongside his own. The storm raged on, and he knew they couldn't stay, that they were out there somewhere, hunting her as relentlessly as the wind hunted the plane. He saddled Jericho, his hands steady despite the questions swirling in his mind, and helped her onto the horse, her body light as a shadow. They rode into the dawn, her silence a companion as constant as the snow, and Harper vowed to learn her story, not by force but by time, by proving that some hands could heal rather than harm. Her fear, her mystery, her haunted eyes, they were a mirror to his own pain, and in them, he saw a chance for redemption, a reason to face the cold, unforgiving world once more. The Wyoming wilderness stretched before them, vast and merciless, but for the first time in years, Harper Kane didn't feel alone. In the Wyoming wilderness, where the wind carved sorrow into the bones of the earth, Harper Kane, and the woman who called herself Etta, forged a fragile alliance, bound not by words, but by the weight of their silences, each carrying a past too heavy to speak aloud. Their nights filled with the crackle of firelight, and the unspoken questions that hung like frost in the air. That first night in the hunter's cabin, they shared no names, only the warmth of the fire, and the mutual understanding that some wounds are too raw for words. Harper, with his war-torn heart, and memories of men he'd hanged, and Etta, her eyes like shattered glass, reflecting a terror deeper than the cold that had nearly claimed her. Come morning, as the storm's fury softened to a bitter whisper, she refused to ride toward town, her voice a low hiss. No sheriff, and Harper, a man who'd learned to trust instinct over inquiry, nodded, sensing her fear wasn't of the law, but of something far darker, something that wore a human face. He didn't press, didn't ask for the story behind her torn dress, or the scars that mapped her wrists like a cruel cartographer's work. Instead, he offered her his old coat, its wool frayed but warm, and they rode on, Jericho's hooves crunching through snow-dusted trails. The vast emptiness of Wyoming, both a refuge and a threat. Days passed in quiet rhythm, Etta cleaning herself in icy rivers, her movements quick and guarded, like a deer sensing a predator's gaze, and Harper watching from a distance, piecing together fragments of her truth. She wasn't fleeing justice, she was running from something worse, something that had clawed its way into her soul, and left her flinch at every shadow. He saw it in the way she scanned the horizon, her hands trembling, not from cold but from memory, and he wondered what kind of monster could instill such dread, that the wilderness, with its wolves and blizzards, seemed a safer bet. One night, under a sky heavy with stars, Etta woke screaming, a sound so raw, so primal, it seemed to tear through the fabric of the night, a wail that didn't belong to anything living. And Harper, heart pounding, sat still, his hands empty of comfort, knowing touch could break her more than the cold ever had. He waited, the fire's glow casting ghosts across her face, until dawn painted the sky in hues of gray and gold, and she spoke, her voice steady but hollow. "You ever kill a man?" The question landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Harper's memories of battlefields, of nooses tightened under orders, of eyes that pleaded or cursed, as life left them. "Oh yes," he said, his voice rough with truth, and her reply, good was a blade, sharp and cold, slicing through the air with a weight that made him shiver. What had she survived to ask such a thing? The question burned in him, igniting a curiosity as fierce as the fire that kept them alive. But he held his tongue, knowing some truths are earned, not demanded. He thought of Clara, the woman he'd loved and lost to the war's shadow, her face fading with each passing year, and wondered if Etta's scars came from a love turned cruel, a hand that struck instead of held, or a community that preached salvation while wielding damnation. They rode on, through valleys where the wind sang of forgotten lives, Etta's silence a fortress, her rare words, about the stars the way a hawk hunts, never her past, precious as water in a desert. Harper began to see her not as a stranger but as a mirror, her fear reflecting his own, her survival a testament to a strength he'd thought he'd lost. He noticed how she gripped the knife he'd given her, not for him, but for the unseen they she'd whispered at, and he wondered if they were a single man, a father, a husband, a preacher with a twisted gospel, or a pack of wolves in human skin, hunting her for reasons she couldn't yet name. Each night as they camped under pines that stood like sentinels, he watched her sleep, her face softening but never at peace, and he felt a pull to protect her, not out of duty but out of a shared brokenness, a need to prove that some hands could still be kind. He told her stories of his boyhood, of fishing in rivers now frozen, hoping to coax a smile but her lips remained a line, her eyes fixed on some distant horror. Yet there were moments when she'd braid her hair by the fire, or when she'd hum a tune so soft it might have been the wind that hinted at a person she'd been before fear claimed her. Harper's mind churned with possibilities. Had she been sold, betrayed or cast out? Had she seen blood spilled, or spilled it herself? Her question about killing lingered, a clue to a past where violence was both wound and weapon, and he wondered if she'd taken a life to save her own, if her fear was born of guilt as much as terror. As they crossed a frozen creek, its surface cracked like her composure, she spoke again, her voice a whisper, "They won't stop." Harper's blood ran cold, not from the words but from the certainty in them, and he knew then that her pursuers were real, relentless, and closer than he'd hoped. He checked his Colt, its weight a grim comfort, and scanned the horizon, seeing nothing but snow and shadow yet feeling the prickle of danger. Etta's eyes met his, and for the first time he saw not just fear but defiance, a spark that said she'd fight, even if it broke her. He wanted to ask who were they, what had they done, but he held back, knowing trust was a fragile bridge, built slowly, and he'd walk it with her, step by step through the cold and the unknown. The Wyoming trails stretched on, merciless and vast, but in Etta's presence, Harper felt a purpose reignite, a reason to face the ghosts of his past and hers, to unravel the mystery of her fear, and perhaps in doing so, find a way to heal them both. In the unforgiving Wyoming wilderness, where the wind sang dirges through skeletal pines, and the snow buried secrets as deep as the earth's own heart, Harper Kane and Etta carved a path through days that blended into weeks, their bond a fragile thread, woven from shared silences, and the slow, cautious blooming of trust. Each moment a battle against the ghosts that haunted them both, Harper with his memories of war, of nooses and lost love, and Etta with her unspoken horrors, her eyes like storm clouds hiding a lightning strike. As weeks passed, Etta began to come alive again, her skin losing asceticism, losing its deathly blue, her cheeks warming with color, her hands steady as she mended Harper's torn saddlebag with a needle and thread, her gaze sharp as she read the sky for signs of storms, or tracked a deer's prints through the snow, with the precision of a born hunter, skills that spoke of a life before fear had claimed her, a life Harper could only guess at. Yet her silence remained a cloak, heavy and impenetrable, guarding a past etched in the scars he glimpsed on her wrists and neck, burns, cuts, old wounds that whispered of pain she refused to name. Each mark a riddle that fueled his curiosity, a map to a story she held locked within. One crisp morning they found a dying hawk, its wing broken, its eyes fierce with fading life. Etta knelt beside it, her touch gentle as she fed it water from her palm, whispering soft words until it stilled and she buried it beneath a pine, her hands digging through frozen earth, as she murmured a prayer, in a tongue Harper didn't know, its cadence haunting like a song from a world long lost. "I don't believe in God," she said after, her voice low but firm, "but maybe he believes in me." And Harper, a man who'd long abandoned faith, felt a pang in his chest, wondering what kind of God would let her suffer enough to doubt his existence, yet still pray for a broken bird. Her words lingered, a puzzle as complex as the scars she bore, and he wondered if her faith was a remnant of a childhood stolen, or a defiance against a world that had tried to break her. Days later they stumbled upon a burned-out farm, its charred timbers stark against the snow, a fresh grave marked by a crude cross behind the ruins, and Etta stood before it, her eyes fixed on the mound, her face unreadable but heavy with something unspoken, as if the grave held a piece of her own story. "This land doesn't heal," she said, her voice like the wind, cold and cutting, "it just bleeds again," and Harper felt the truth of it, the Wyoming wilderness a mirror to their own unhealed wounds, its vastness a canvas for pain that refused to fade. That night, as they sheltered in the farm's crumbling chimney corner, the fire's dying warmth casting shadows that danced like memories, Etta's voice broke the silence, soft and tentative. "You ever lose someone you'd kill for?" Harper's heart clenched, Clara's face flashing in his mind, her laughter, her warmth gone when the war turned him into a stranger, and he answered, yes, his voice rough with the weight of it. Etta reached across the blanket, her fingers brushing his, not in fear but in a quiet, deliberate act, as if testing whether he was real, whether trust could exist in a world that had burned her so deeply. Her touch was a spark, a moment of connection that felt like a thaw after an endless winter, and Harper's breath caught, his curiosity burning brighter than the embers before them. What had she endured to make such a gesture feel like a leap across a chasm? He saw the scars again in the firelight, burns that spoke of fire not just on skin but in her soul, and he wondered if they came from a captor's cruelty, a family's betrayal, or a community that turned on its own. Had she been chained, branded, or punished for defying someone's twisted sense of righteousness? Her question about loss echoed his own, and he pictured her running not from lawmen but from men who'd claimed ownership over her body or spirit, perhaps a husband who struck instead of loved, a preacher who preached salvation while wielding pain, or a band of outlaws who saw her as prey. The grave they'd found haunted him. Was it someone she'd loved, someone she'd killed for, or both? Her prayer for the hawk, her defiance in the face of a godless world, her fleeting touch, all were clues to a woman who'd survived horrors that made the wilderness seem kind. As they rode on, Jericho's hooves, steady through the snow, Harper watched her, noting how she scanned the horizon, her knife always close, her eyes darting to shadows, as if they were still out there, the unseen pursuers she'd whispered of, relentless as the wind. He wondered if they were one man, a father, a lover, a captor, or many, a pack of wolves in human form, hunting her for reasons she guarded like a fortress. Each night by the fire he shared stories of his boyhood, of rivers and stars, hoping to draw her out, but she offered only fragments, a tale of a hawk she'd once freed, a song her mother sang, never the heart of her pain. Yet her touch that night lingered in his mind, a sign she was beginning to see him not as a threat, but as a shield, and he vowed to protect her, not out of pity but because her survival mirrored his own, her mystery a call to redeem the man he'd lost in the war. The Wyoming trails stretched on, vast and merciless, but Etta's small gestures, her mending, her tracking, her prayer, were proof of a spirit that refused to break, and Harper's curiosity grew, a need to know what she'd survived, what had made her fear people more than death, and whether he could help her find peace in a land that bled without healing. As winter clamped its icy jaws around the Wyoming wilderness, slowing Harper, Kane, and Etta to a crawl through snow-choked trails, they sought refuge in caves where the wind's howl dulled to a mournful hum. Sharing meager rations of jerky and hardtack, their silence is a language deeper than words, each moment heavy with the weight of their unspoken pasts. Harper's scarred by war and loss, Etta's shrouded in a terror that made her flinch at shadows, yet wield a knife with steady hands. In those dim firelit hollows, they carved out a fragile existence, Harper setting traps for rabbits while Etta, with a quiet competence, mended their gear, and one night, returning to find her sewing his tattered coat, sleeves rolled up with a familiarity that stirred a memory of home, he spoke without thinking, "You look like a wife." Her eyes met his, steady and unblinking, and she said, "I was," her voice a whisper that carried a lifetime of pain, a confession that hung between them like frost on a spider's web, fragile yet sharp, and Harper, respecting the chasm of her past, didn't press, though curiosity burned in him. What kind of marriage had left her scarred, hunted and alone? Her silence, once a fortress, began to crack, not with words, but with small acts, the way she portioned their food evenly, her fingers brushing his, as she passed a canteen, her gaze lingering longer, as if seeing him anew. When the storm finally broke, leaving the world glittering under a cruel sun, a lone rider appeared, his horse's breath steaming in the cold, and Etta stepped out to face him, her posture rigid, her hand on the knife at her belt, while Harper watched from the cave's mouth, his Colt ready but his heart uneasy. The rider's face twisted with shock. "Jesus, you're alive." But Etta's silence was a wall, her eyes cold as the snow beneath her feet, and Harper, stepping beside her, noticed the rider's horse bore a marshal's brand, a detail that tightened his gut. "That horse was a marshal's," he said, his voice low. "He's dead now." The rider's hand twitched toward his shotgun, but Etta moved faster, her pistol flashing in a single clean shot that dropped him before he could draw, her face as cold and unyielding as the winter itself. Harper stared, heart pounding as she knelt beside the body, her hands steady but her breath uneven, and when he asked, "Who was he?" she whispered, "One of 5, her words a blade that cut through the silence, heavy with dread and mystery. As they buried the man in the frozen earth, Harper noticed a change in her. Her silence had grown denser, not with fear but with a resolve that felt like a storm gathering strength, her eyes holding a darkness that wasn't just pain but purpose. That night, by the fire's fading glow, she sat closer, her shoulder brushing his, watching him with an intensity that made his skin prickle, as if she were measuring his soul against some unseen scale. The freeze inside her was thawing, her touch no longer tentative but deliberate, yet something darker stirred beneath, a shadow of vengeance or guilt that made Harper's questions multiply. Who were the 5? Were they her pursuers, the they she feared, or something more, a family, a cult, a band of men, who'd bound her to a life she'd fled? Her skill with the pistol, her unflinching shot, spoke of a woman who'd learned to kill not out of anger but necessity, and he wondered what horrors had forged her into this paradox of fragility and steel. Had she been a bride turned prisoner, a daughter betrayed, or a survivor of some unspeakable right? The marshal's horse gnawed at him. Had she killed its owner, or had the rider? And why did her survival shock the man so deeply? Harper thought of Clara, the woman he'd lost, whose memory still ached like a bruise, and saw in Etta a similar wound, but where his was softened by time,
Hers was raw, bleeding with every glance at the horizon. He shared stories of his boyhood to ease the tension, tales of fishing under starlit skies, but her responses were sparse, her mind elsewhere, perhaps with the 4 who remained of the 5 she'd named. Each night, as they huddled against the cold, her presence became a tether, pulling him from the abyss of his own regrets. Yet her mystery deepened, her scars a map he couldn't read, her prayer for the hawk echoing in his mind. A woman who didn't believe in God but buried a bird with reverence, who killed without hesitation yet touched him with care. He wondered if the burned farm they'd found was hers, if the grave held her husband or her child, or if it marked the first of the 5 she'd faced. Her question about loss, "You ever lose someone you'd kill for?" rang in his ears, and her touch that night, fleeting but real, felt like a promise or a plea, a sign she was beginning to trust him. Yet her growing resolve hinted at a reckoning she was preparing to face alone. The wilderness stretched on, vast and merciless, its silence broken only by the crunch of snow under Jericho's hooves, and Harper felt the weight of her past pressing against his own, her thawing heart a beacon in the cold, but her darkening gaze a warning that the storm she carried was far from over, and he vowed to stand by her, not just to unravel her story, but to face whatever hunted her, knowing their survival depended on the truths they'd yet to share.
Spring broke over the Wyoming wilderness, with a vengeance, melting snow into rivers of mud and blood. As Harper, Kane and Eta pressed onward, her silence no longer just a shield, but a weapon, sharpened by the names of 5 men she carried like a curse. 1 dead in the snow, 4 still breathing, their sins the root of her pain. And Harper, bound to her by a tether of trust and shared scars, followed her into a reckoning that felt as inevitable as the thaw. Eta had revealed the names in a whisper one night, her voice steady but her eyes burning with a fire that chilled him. 5 men who'd shattered her world, and the second, Judge Cray, waited in Trinidad, a man whose title was a lie, a trafficker who sold people like cattle, who hurt women, and called Eta niece with a smile that masked his cruelty, a man she named not kin but target. She'd stared into the fire as she spoke, her words sparse but heavy. "He thinks I died in Nebraska," and Harper, his heart twisting at the thought of what she'd endured, saw the weight of her survival, a defiance against a man who tried to erase her. In Trinidad, under a sky bruised with clouds, Eta, dressed in black, her face pale as a ghost's, and walked into Cray's saloon like a specter, returned to claim justice, her steps unwavering, her pistol hidden beneath Harper's old coat. Harper followed minutes later, his Colt ready, his pulse loud in his ear, knowing this was her fight, but unable to stay back. The saloon was thick with smoke and laughter, until Eta's single shot cut through, clean and final, and Cray slumped in his chair, his eyes wide with shock, staring into the face of the girl he'd sold, the girl he thought dead. And no one in the room cried for him, sensitive men like him, their silence a testament to his cruelty. Eta said nothing for days after, her gaze distant, her hands steady but her soul shaken, and Harper watched her, his curiosity a quiet ache. What had Cray done to her, and how had she survived what he believed had killed her? One night, under a moon that bathed the plains in silver, she came to him, wordless, her touch raw and real, their silence turning into a closeness that spoke of trust earned through blood, a moment where their shared pain became something more, something alive. They rode on to Utah, the air warming but the weight of her mission heavier, tracking the 3rd man, Broderick, a monster cloaked in wealth, hiding behind hired guns in a dusty canyon town. Eta found him alone at dawn, his guards drunk and useless, and with a rock clutched in her trembling hands, she ended him, her face a mask of rage and grief, the act less clean than Cray's death, more desperate, as if the weight of her past had poured into that single brutal strike. Harper caught her as she stumbled back, her hands bloodied, her body shaking, and held her as she cried, her sobs raw and wrenching, the first time he'd seen her break, and he wondered what Broderick had taken from her, a sister, a mother, a piece of her soul to make her kill with such fury. 2 names remained, each a step closer to the heart of her pain,
and Harper's mind churned with questions. Who were these men, these 5, and what had they done to bind her to them with such hatred? Had they been a family that betrayed her, a cult that branded her, or a gang that saw her as property? The scars on her wrists, the burns he'd glimpsed, whispered of torture, of captivity, and he pictured a younger Eta, perhaps a bride or a daughter, caught in a web of cruelty she'd barely escaped. Her prayer for the hawk, her cold precision with a gun, her trembling hands after Broderick's death, all painted a woman forged in fire, her faith in God gone but her will unbroken, and Harper felt a pull to protect her, not just from the men who hunted her, but from the darkness growing within her, the vengeance that threatened to consume what little light she had left. Each night by the fire she sat closer, her touch no longer fleeting but seeking, as if anchoring herself to him, and he shared stories of his past, Clara's laugh, the war's horrors, hoping to draw her out, but she offered only fragments, a song from her childhood, a memory of a river where she'd once felt free. The burned farm, the grave, the marshal's horse, they haunted him, clues to a story she guarded fiercely, and he wondered if the grave held someone she'd loved, someone she'd killed for, or if it marked the first of her 5. Her question about loss, you ever lose someone you'd kill for, rang in his ears, and her touch after Cray's death, her tears after Broderick's, felt like a bridge between them, fragile but real. As they rode toward the next name, the wilderness unfolding in green and gold, Harper saw her resolve harden, her silence heavier with each kill, and he feared what the last 2 names held, a husband, a father, a preacher, and what truth would surface when the final man fell. The spring air carried the scent of new life, but for Eta, it was a season of death, and Harper vowed to stand by her, not just to unravel the mystery of her pain, but to keep her from losing herself to it, knowing that the 2 names left were not just men, but the roots of a wound that might never heal. As spring bled into summer, the Montana wilderness unfolded in a riot of green, but for Harper Kane and Eta, the air carried the weight of blood and unfinished debts, their journey now a hunt for the firth of Eta's 5 names. Fletcher Bain, a man who'd once worn a uniform, his authority, a mask for cruelty, who'd held Eta's face in one hand, and a pistol in the other, his actions so vile that Harper, watching her haunted eyes, guessed children were involved, a suspicion she didn't deny, her silence a confirmation that cut deeper than words. They tracked Bain to a sprawling ranch house, its whitewashed walls hiding his sins, and Eta, disguised as a maid in a borrowed dress, slipped inside under the guise of servitude, her movements silent as a shadow, her knife a gleam of vengeance, while Bain knelt in prayer, his voice a mockery of piety. She slit his throat with a single swift stroke, her face cold but her hands trembling with the weight of memory, and Harper, waiting outside, heard the silence that followed, his heart pounding with questions about what Bain had done to earn such a death. Later, by a fire under Montana's endless sky, Eta spoke the truth, her voice low and raw. The last name was her father, a man who'd sold her to keep his farm, trading her life for land, now posing as a preacher in Kansas, writing sermons about forgiveness, while the scars on her body brands, told the story of his betrayal. Harper's gut twisted, picturing a young Eta, barely more than a child, handed over to men like Cray and Bain, her father's greed the root of her pain, and he wondered how she'd survived, how she'd climbed out of the grave. Her father thought he'd buried her. They rode south, the plains giving way to Kansas fields, Ulden under a merciless sun, and Eta's silence grew heavier, not with fear but with a purpose that chilled Harper, her resolve a blade honed by each kill. In a small-town church, she walked in, her black dress stark against the whitewashed pews, and faced her father, now a gaunt man with eyes that widened in recognition, as she asked, "Do you know me?" His whispered, "Yes," was a confession, too late to undo the past, and Eta's voice cut through the sacred air. "You buried me," he stammered. "No, But she stepped closer, her scars bared in the candlelight, and said, "You tried, but I climbed out." Her words a reckoning, each one making him flinch, as she recounted every scar, every night of torment, her voice steady but her eyes blazing with a pain that had festered for years. She didn't draw her pistol, didn't raise her knife. Instead, she made him understand, her presence a mirror to his sins, and then she walked out, leaving him alive to carry the weight of her survival. Outside, under a sky heavy with stars, she turned to Harper and smiled. Not a mask, not a weapon, but a real smile, fragile and fierce, the first he'd seen, and in that moment, he saw the woman beneath the wounds, a soul that had fought through darkness to find light, and his own heart, long frozen by war and loss, thawed at the sight, stirring with a warmth he hadn't felt since Clara. The act of sparing her father shifted, something in Eta, as if confronting the root of her pain, had freed a piece of her, but her words, "Now it begins," sent a shiver through Harper, a promise of something new, not vengeance but a life reclaimed, yet shadowed by the mystery of what it meant. Had she spared her father to punish him with guilt, or was it a step toward healing? The burned farm, the grave, the hawk's prayer, they swirled in Harper's mind, clues to a past where she'd been sold, tortured, and left for dead, yet risen like a ghost, to hunt her betrayers. He wondered about the children, her own perhaps, or siblings lost to men like Bane, and what horrors had forged her into this paradox of fragility and steel. Each night, by the fire, she sat closer, her touch no longer tentative, but her fingers tracing his scars as if mapping a shared language of pain, and Harper shared stories of Clara, of battles, hoping to draw her out, but she offered only fragments, a lullaby, her mother sang, a river where she'd dreamed of freedom. The marshal's horse, the rider's shock, the 5 names they painted a picture of a girl betrayed by those meant to protect her, her father the first, and Harper's curiosity burned. How had she escaped? Had she killed to survive, or to avenge? Her smile in Kansas, raw and real, was a beacon, but her words hinted at a new chapter, one where she'd face not men, but herself, and Harper felt a pull to stand by her, not just to unravel her story, but to protect the woman emerging from the wounds, the woman who'd thawed his heart, as surely as she'd begun to heal her own. The plains stretched on, vast and golden, and as they rode, Eta's smile lingered in Harper's mind, a sign of hope, amidst the blood, but her final words echoed, a mystery yet to unfold, and he knew their journey was far from over, their hearts bound by pain, and the promise of something new.
In the Dakota Territory, where the wind whispered through ancient pines, and the earth held secrets as old as time, Harper Kane and Eta chose to stop running, their hearts no longer tethered to fear, but to the heavy history they carried, his marked by war, and a love lost to shadows, hers by betrayal, and a vengeance that had carved her into a paradox of fragility and steel. And together, they built a home, hidden among the trees, a sanctuary of rough-hewn logs and quiet hopes, where they worked with calloused hands, planting roots in soil as stubborn as their spirits. They ate together at a table, Harper carved, laughed over small victories, a good harvest, a repaired roof, and Eta hummed softly while cooking, her voice a fragile melody that wove through the cabin, while Harper read poetry aloud, his voice rough but warm, lines of Whitman and Frost, filling the air with dreams they'd thought long buried. They stopped looking over their shoulders, though Harper kept his rifle by the door, its presence, a silent acknowledgement of a world that never fully forgets. Their days were filled with the rhythm of season, the creak of a porch swing, the scent of pine and bread, but the past lingered like a shadow, and Harper wondered what ghosts still haunted Eta's dreams, what truths lay behind her scars, burns, cuts, brands from a father who sold her, from men like Cray and Bane who'd tried to break her. One winter morning, a bounty poster appeared in a nearby town, nailed to a saloon wall, Eta's name scrawled in bold, 10,000 coins, not for a lawman's justice, but for mercenaries, men who hunted for gold, not truth, and Harper's guts twisted, knowing the past had found them, its claws sharp and relentless. When the mercenaries came, 5 shadows moving through the snow, Etta stepped outside barefoot, her breath steaming in the cold, her voice steady as she faced them. "You came to kill me. Leave him." Their leader sneered. "No, you both die," and the air erupted in gunfire. Harper shot first, his aim true despite the years, and Etta shot last, her pistol a final word in a language of survival, her face cold but her hands trembling as the snow settled over 5 bodies, their blood staining the white expanse. Harper staggered, a bullet in his side, blood seeping through his shirt, but alive, and Etta knelt beside him, her eyes wide with fear, not for herself but for him, and whispered, "Promise me you won't leave." "I promise," he said, his voice weak but resolute, and she held his hand, her touch a lifeline through the pain. They tended his wound in the cabin, her hands steady as she stitched him closed, and in the silence that followed, Harper's curiosity burned. Who had sent the mercenary? Was it her father, still preaching forgiveness while hiring killers, or some unknown enemy tied to the 5 men she'd hunted? Years passed, and no more bounty hunters came, the world seeming to forget Etta's name, leaving them to seasons of work and quiet, planting in spring, harvesting in fall, winters by the fire where Etta's humming grew bolder, her smiles no longer rare but frequent, lighting her face like dawn after a long night. Harper walked with a cane, his wound a lingering ache, but peace settled in his chest, a warmth he hadn't known since Clara, and he saw Etta transform, the woman beneath the wounds emerging, her laughter a sound as real as the wind through the trees. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the sky ablaze with sunset, she hummed a tune and Harper, his heart full, said, "You're singing." She paused, then laughed, a sound so pure it seemed to heal the air itself, and said, "I guess I am," her voice carrying a joy that felt like a victory over the broken world they'd survived. Yet questions lingered in Harper's mind. What had her father done after Kansas, after she'd faced him and walked away? Had the mercenaries been his final act, or was there another shadow out there waiting? The burned farm, the grave, the hawk's prayer, they were pieces of a puzzle he still couldn't fully solve, clues to a past where Etta had been sold, tortured and left for dead, yet risen to reclaim her life. Her touch, once tentative, now sought his freely, her fingers tracing his scars as he traced hers, their shared pain a bridge to something deeper, a love born not of grand gestures but of quiet moments, her humming, his poetry, their hands working side by side. He wondered about the children he'd suspected, whether they were hers or lost to her, and what horrors had forged her into a woman who could kill with a rock yet pray for a bird. The bounty poster haunted him, a reminder that her past could still reach them, but her smile, her laughter, her song, they were proof of a spirit unbroken, and Harper felt his own heart mend, his promise to stay a vow as sacred as any oath. In their hidden home, they'd built more than a shelter, they'd built a life, and as Etta sang, her voice rising over the Dakota hills, Harper knew they'd not just survived but lived, their love a defiance against a world that had tried to bury them both. Yet questions remained. What began after Kansas? Would it ever truly end? And he held her close, ready to face whatever came, their hearts entwined in a peace hard won and fiercely guarded.